you, brother. Good evening. Yeah, I think along the lines of what Mark was saying, I think it's every once in a while you kind of got to set your life up and you just kind of got to run your balance sheet, not just with your time, but with your money and your energy and be like, compared to the world, where do I put in God? And I think that's always in my mind. I always kind of picture, of course, nobody uses checkbooks anymore, but I always kind of picture a checkbook ledger. And at the beginning of that ledger, you got this many hours. And if you would write down, just like you did a check, every time that you did something, how many hours, you'd be surprised the hours we spend doing, like Mark says, doing little things, eating, watching TV, sitting on our phone, but all those hours, all that time adds up, doesn't it? Deducts from the total, just like on a checkbook, doesn't it? And at the end, of my day, sometimes I wonder where God ranked in that checkbook, in that balance. So yeah, I think it's an interesting thought for sure. I think I spent a lot of hours in church, but I can honestly tell you I don't regret a single one of them. And I can tell you one thing. Nobody on earth's going to lay on their deathbed and says, boy, I wish I'd gone to church less. Promise you that. so anyway, good thought for sure. Oh, Hebrews 8. We're kind of getting into the crux of Hebrews before it's kind of going to change gears on us a little bit. Talking once again about the high priest, Jesus, who sat down at the right hand of God. And I think we've talked about that some. It's an illustration we can relate to. The idea being Jesus being God's right-hand man. Influence, Jesus has his ear. I think how we struggle with that whole thing is, Jesus, God are one, essentially. And I think when we see this type of a division in that, we kind of, I think sometimes that kind of throws us, but I think it's in stuff we can understand. That's the best way I know to tell you. I think God tries to present it in a way that's understandable to you and me. And I think in order to do that, you have to put it in a way we can see it. And I think that's how we see it, or how we should see it. Jesus not being less than God, Jesus being equal to God, Jesus not being lesser than. But once again, we see that type of interaction, if you want to, that intercessor that we look towards Jesus to intercede for us, more approachable than God, for sure. And I think that's, God's a little scary, right? God is to me a little scary. Was to everybody, right? Throughout history, God's been powerful and scary and kind of unapproachable, am I right? Throughout the Bible. And you always had to get somebody to go to God for you, God never said, come to me yourself. It's always like, send somebody to me, So I think it's a shift in our theology, I guess you might say. But in Hebrews, he tries to parallel it between old and new. And the idea of Christ's role, God's role, our role, and how that morphs together. But he's talking to Jews, and Jews understood the temple. They understood the temple. And if you understand the temple, which we don't that well because we're not Jewish, and the temple doesn't exist anymore. So it's not like we can go look, right? What we know about the temple, we know from the Bible and Jewish tradition and a guy by the name of Edersheim. And it's an interesting book, but it's like reading dirt. I mean, it's dry. I mean, you just got to force yourself through it. But he explains a lot about the temple, Jewish customs, temple worship. The temple had several areas, right? Had an outer court in the Jerusalem anyway. Now the tabernacle in the wilderness was a bit different than that, but when we got to temple worship, what I would call the real temple, Solomon's temple, and the remake of that, and then of course what we would call Herod's temple, actually, which was a remake of the temple that they made after the destruction of Jerusalem. But there was an outer court there, what they called the court of Gentiles, or court of women. And that was where pretty much everybody could go. Proselytes to Judaism, the Ethiopian eunuch, he could have went into that, what we call the outer court. But then if you went past that outer court, there was an inner court. And that was men only. And it was only clean men. So you couldn't have a disease, you couldn't be emasculated, eunuchs weren't allowed, Gentiles weren't allowed. Most, I don't think, proselytes were really allowed into that inner court. It was so that was and there was actually a plaque that archaeologists have found that stood at that inner deal, and it basically said, if you're not authorized to enter, I forget exactly how it reads, but basically said, if you're not a man, if you're not authorized to enter, the penalty is death. So it was a big deal to go into that inner court if you weren't authorized basically to go into that. And then beyond that, there was the sacrifice, the table, that would all be in the inner court. And then there was what we would call the sanctuary, or the holy place, we would call that. And that's where the sacrifice is actually made, the table of showbread, the altar of incense. That was in that outer sanctuary. And then beyond that, beyond the veil, was the Holy of Holies, where God dwelt in Jewish thought. The Ark of the Covenant, until Babylonian captivity. The Ark of the Covenant was in the inner, the Holy of Holies. So that was shrouded off by a veil, and nobody could go into that but the high priest, and he only did that one time a year. So it was basically closed off. And the veil of the Holy of Holies in Herod's temple was 3 inches thick, solid woven, 3 inches thick, if you can imagine. That's kind of unbelievable. 10 centimeters, basically 3 inches thick, solid woven, no seam. And it was held by a big stone beam that they say weighed about 15 tons. And when Jesus was crucified, according to Josephus, that beam broke. That veil was rent, tore. So it takes a lot to tear 3 inches of woven material, right? And according to Scripture, and according, I think, to Josephus too, it ripped from the top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. So ripped from the top to the bottom, which I think is significant, actually. So, but anyway, that's kind of how the temple was laid out. And then the Hebrew writer kind of draws a parallel between us and the temple. Us here, Christ, and the temple. So we kind of draw a parallel about where we fit in this whole basic system. That basically that was just a picture of heaven, basically. The sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. So he's talking about the true sanctuary, which is where Christ is now. Remember, one says Christ at the right hand of God, and he said this is the true sanctuary. Every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, so it is necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on the earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer gifts prescribed by the law. That's a very confusing verse. If Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest. Why? Wasn't Levi, wrong tribe, right? If Jesus was on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, is the argument of the Hebrew writer. He said, for they're already priests. They serve at a sanctuary. This is before the destruction of the temple. We know that because it talks as the temple in being. So temple was destroyed in 71 AD. So this is before that. It says it's a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. So it's a copy of heaven, okay? The temple in earth was a copy of the temple in heaven. So when God told Moses how to build the temple and the tabernacle here, he was patterning that patterning that. English is my first language. After what was in heaven, okay? And so so it says, they serve in a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. He warned Moses. He said, I told you exactly how to make it, how big to make it, what to make it out of, what it should look like. And he warned him. He says, you need to do this exactly like I told you to do it. Exactly. So he told him how big it was going to be, how it was supposed to be built, what materials were going to be used, who was going to do it. God was very specific about the temple, very specific about the temple. This is what it should be. And that tabernacle that they carried in the wilderness existed all the way up until Solomon built a temple. So that tabernacle existed and was where they worshiped and where the high priest offered sacrifice for many, many years, till Solomon actually built the temple. That existed. So all the way through Judges, all the way through Samuel, all the way through David, it was at this tent, okay, that they carried around in the wilderness. And it said, Moses was warned, do it just exactly how I tell you. The ministry, but in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is superior to theirs, as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. What was the first covenant established? What was the promises established? What was the first covenant established on? What promise was of the first covenant? What was the promise of the first covenant? Huh? Yeah, God's promise to Abraham. Promise of the first covenant was God's promise to Abraham. What came down with the law, the promise of that covenant was basically the land of Canaan, right? You're going to get the land of Canaan. That was the promise. That's what you were going to get. What's our promise? Heaven. Our promise is better, okay? Our promise is better. If there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. Can you have two covenants at the same time with God? Wouldn't make any sense. Why would you do that? So our covenant replaced that covenant. And if that's the case, that covenant is no longer in effect. Okay? The old covenant is done. It's no longer in effect. The covenant that the Hebrew writer is talking about is a relationship between God and Israel. Okay? God and Israel. What happened? What did God basically do? In simple terms, what did God do to Israel? He did what to him? Yeah, but I know it's hard. I'm not getting the right place to help you. He divorced them, right? God divorced Israel. Am I right? Because Israel played the harlot, right? So God divorced Israel. Our God is a divorced God, okay? He divorced Israel. And when he did that, he established another covenant through Jesus Christ, the new covenant. But because he divorced Israel, and if you read Jeremiah and read those prophets, that's exactly what he did. He did away with them. You're no longer going to be mine. You're no longer going to be my bride. Okay? So now his bride is what? The church. So if his bride was still Israel, and his bride was the church, then that would make God a polygamist, right? God couldn't do that. God wouldn't do that. So in order for him to have the church as a bride, he can no longer have Israel as a bride, okay? So if that's the case, is there any salvation in Judaism? Can't happen, right? Verse Mark read, John 14:6, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man come to the Father except through me, right? There's no other way. So Judaism is no longer a viable way to get to God, to get to heaven, because Judaism was never a way to get to heaven. Are y'all following me on this? Judaism could never get you to heaven. The Hebrew writer's going to talk us through this. But Judaism could never get you heaven. So why now do we think that Judaism can get heaven? It never could. Nothing's changed. It never could do that. Only Christ can get us to heaven. So it says, if there had been nothing wrong with the first, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful. And I, what? Turned away from them, declares the Lord. But he says here, he says, I'm going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So how can that be now? Because we're not Israel, right? And we're not Judah. I can't trace my lineage back to Abraham, right? I'm not of that lineage. I'm not of that house, not of those people. But my covenant is with Christ. So how can that be since I'm not an Israelite? Yeah, let's, the fact of this is going to be, is that you and I are Israel. Now, I know that might sound kind of confusing, but you and I are Israel. Galatians 3:26 says, for you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, listen to what Paul says, then you are Abraham's descendants. So if we're Abraham's descendants, spiritually, what are we? We're Israel, you see? And it says, and heirs according to promise. Okay? So in other words, you and I are Israel by faith. We're spiritual Israel. So when God said, I'm going to build a covenant with Israel and Judah, and I think it's interesting he makes a distinction here between Israel and Judah. Because Israel and Judah were considered, from very early on, two basically different entities. Israel was, when the kingdom divided after Solomon, under Jeroboam and Rehoboam, it became two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. Israel was carried off by the Assyrians, 520, never heard from again, scattered throughout the land. Don't know where they're at. Okay? So in the Old Testament, God's saying, I'm going to bring Israel back. I'm going to restore Israel. Well, how on earth are you going to do that? You see, Israel is intermingled. Israel's in Europe. Israel's in Spain. Israel's all over. The little remnant of Israel that remained was in Samaria, but they were intermingled with the Assyrians. So there's no like pure blood Israel left. It doesn't exist. I mean, I'm sure God can do anything. You know, Jesus said, I can raise up from these stones children of Abraham, right? But it doesn't make sense when he said that. Judah, on the other hand, Judah existed. Judah still existed intact at the time of Jesus. You see, Judah still existed. That's what we talk about Israel in the New Testament. We're talking about Judah. We're talking about Israel. We're talking about Judah. Because Israel's long gone by the New Testament. Israel, we call it the lost tribes. We call them that for a reason, because they're lost. Right? You can't find them anymore. They're intermingled through Europe is where they wound up. They wound up through Europe. They wound up all the way east, across the Euphrates. All those areas, Iran, what we call now Iran, Iraq, all that Middle Eastern area. And if you go on past that, you go India, and you go Mongolia and China. They're scattered all over. So when he says, I'm going to make it with Israel and Judah, he's talking about us. Now, the Jews didn't want to understand that. They said, well, it's just us. We're just the Jews. But that's why Paul said, oh, but listen, you're all sons of Abraham through faith. In other words, we're all sons of Abraham. So we are spiritual Israel. So when he says, I'm going to make a covenant with Israel and Judah, that's us. Okay? That's you and me. That prophecy is fulfilled in us. So that's how come this makes sense. They did not remain faithful, and I turned away. This is a covenant I will establish with the house of Israel after that time. And that's from Jeremiah. I will put their laws in their minds, write them on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbors or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will give their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. That's an Old Testament passage. So this Old Testament, as the Hebrew writer brings up, this Old Testament passage was fulfilled in us. When we say, Christ remembers our sins no more, that's actually an Old Testament passage. And it's right here. This is what you're looking at. That's where we get that idea that Jesus remembers our sin no more. Chooses to remember it no more, I believe is the best way to say that. So that's where that comes from. It's an Old Testament passage. It's brought up. It applies to us. I'm going to write their laws where? On their hearts, on their minds. You see, where did he write the law before? He wrote it on tablets, right? He says, I'm not going to write the law on tablets again. Not going to write tablets of stone with the law. I'm going to write it in your hearts. I'm going to write it in your minds. I'm going to write it within you. Right? And so his law becomes part of us, not just external from us. And I think we miss that idea. We think, well, that just means miraculously God's going to put it in us. That's not what it means. There's nothing miraculous about us having the law of God within us. We get the law of God within us because we studied God's word and we got that within ourselves. That's what it means. But what the point of the passage is not that. Sometimes I think we really miss that. The point of the passage is God's law is no longer going to be external, because that's what the law of Moses was. It was an external law, right? Didn't matter how I was inside. Didn't matter how I felt. Didn't matter if my heart believed it. Didn't matter. It just mattered if I did it. You see, I just had to do it. Didn't make any difference why. I just had to do it. But now it does matter, doesn't it? God took the law from being external, outside of us, what I do, and he put it in us. Where now it's not just what I do, it's why I do it. You see? The law is inside me. It's not external. It's inside me. You see? Mark's Devo is a good illustration of this exact point. As a Jew, you said prayers morning, noon, afternoon, 9, noon, 3, right? Morning prayer, noon prayer, evening prayer, every day, right? You kept the Sabbath, right? Kept the Sabbath. If you didn't keep it, there was punishment. If you violated the Sabbath, there was punishment. So you kept the Sabbath. Didn't matter if you liked to or not. That was not the point. The point is, it was your duty. It's what you did. Just like going to work. It was your duty. You kept the Sabbath. You said your prayers every day. You see? Were they all faithful? Well, I guess that depends on your definition of faithful. Right? They did it. I read this book by this lady, this girl. It's a great book. Wish I could remember the name of it. Anyway, she was raised Muslim, and she went out of that, and it almost cost her life, actually. But she came out of that. Her family was Muslim, moved to America, but she really brought up that point. She said, I said my prayers. I did all this stuff I had to do. That's the way she put it. I had to do it. As a Muslim girl in this household, it was required. They didn't ask me. It was required. She said I had to say my prayers in Aramaic. So I didn't even know what I was praying. Had no idea. But I had to do it. It was my duty. You see? Duty-oriented service. So it's like saying, okay, I'm going to come to church because it's my duty. It's what God expects me to do. It's what my family expects me to do. It's my duty. God doesn't want that, you see. God doesn't want us to be like, well, I have to go to church, right? You know, that shouldn't be our attitude. Well, I have to do it, you know, shouldn't be our attitude. It should be like, I want to go to church. It's where my heart wants to be. I want to be here. I look forward to it. You see, that's what God wants. Not external law, you see, but internal. Am I right? So if God says, I'm going to put it inside you, and I want that to come out of you. So it's really kind of profound, isn't it? He doesn't say I'm miraculously going to write it in within you, and you're miraculously going to know what to do. He's saying, I'm going to take the law from being external, I'm going to make it internal. Are there any comments? Yeah. Yeah, and I think you should have the desire. You want to do it. Not that you feel you have to do it, but you want to do it. Yeah, and that's, I think, the big thing with God. Yeah. Oh, I do. I mean, I think we all go through that. But I think as a parent, when my kids were young, I believe that's one way I really messed up with my kids on Sunday morning, was that idea of getting up and saying, we have to go to church. You know, I wish I'd have never ever said that in my life. I wish I would never use those words. I have to go to church. I just think that's something as a Christian I should never have said. And I said it a lot, you know, especially with my children. We have to go. Well, that's just not right. I mean, I should have never said that. I mean, I feel bad about saying that over my years, you know. We get to go to church. I mean, right? I mean, we get to go to a great place with great people and worship God. I mean, we get to do that. I mean, how many people in the world wish they had that, right? Wish they could say that. I mean, there's 31 countries in the world. The Bible's illegal, I think. I don't know what the current count is, but it's in that number. There's 31 countries in the world that basically people can't wake up on a first day of the week and say, I get to go to church. And they would like to. And you and I, the only thing stopping us is us. I mean, there's nothing else stopping us, right? The only thing stopping us is us. And I don't know. I just think we should desire it, don't you? I think we should desire worship. God wants us to desire it. So, yeah, I think it's a big thing. Sure. Yeah. And there's times in my life, I mean, I'm honest about it. I mean, I'm honest as anybody about it. There's plenty of times in my life, the only reason I came to church was because it was my habit to come. I mean, I've been through times in my life where, yeah, I really didn't want to be here. I'll be the first one to admit it. I mean, but my habit carried me through. But when I come back and think, what's the reason you didn't want to be here? Most of my reasons are pretty sorry, essentially. But, you know, but I just think with our kids, and I know most of us in here don't have young kids. Some of us do. And some of you have grandkids. So I think it's a valid point. But I feel like I messed up in so many ways with my kids when it came to church. And I wish if I could do a do-over, that would be my do-over. I mean, I'm just going to tell you right now, that would be my do-over. I mean, I messed up in a lot of ways, looking back. You know, what do you do now? Like, let it go. I mean, whoops. You know, I can't go back and do a do-over. But, you know, one way, and I'll tell you the two biggest things I think I messed up with my kids. Well, probably the three biggest things I messed up with my kids when it came to church. And one of those is that when I left church on Sunday morning was one of my biggest regrets. Because if there was anything that we was upset about or wrong or whatever it would be, the preacher was off or whatever, you know, that was the first thing we talked about when we got to the car was, well, you know, see so-and-so, or if something happened, or did you see so-and-so there, you see what they were wearing, or, you know, what did it say with that preacher? And I just wish we had never said those things in front of my kids. I just think those are conversations you just don't need to have in front of your kids. I mean, I just think it's fine to have those conversations. It's fine to discuss them with another adult, discuss them with your spouse. I think that's wonderful. But what do your kids hear when you do that? You know, they're sitting there going, well, they don't like it very much either. you know, I mean, that's what your kids hear, you know. And that's one of my biggest regrets. That one is, I regret that. And I think even at home, there's conversations about worship and assembly. If you have young children or grandchildren, think about your conversations you have before you have them. Because some conversations I don't think your kids need to be included in. You know, I don't think they need to know some of that stuff. And the other thing I messed up with my kids is I never really prepared my kids to come to worship. You know, I don't know that I could have done that, but I would like to go back and try. I really would. I would like to go back and try to make Sunday morning more enjoyable for my children than what it was. Because Sunday morning in our household when my kids were little, it was a terror. I mean, you know, none of them had clothes. This one didn't want to wear that. This one didn't want to wear this. Couldn't get them out of bed. Couldn't get their hair done. It was always something. You know, that's how it is with little kids, right? It's always, even when you get ready to go to school, you know, it's always something, right? It's always something. But I wish I would have took time to be like, let's figure out what we're going to wear. And let's be ready. And instead of just making it terrible, you know? And that's what Sunday mornings sometimes were. They were just terrible, you know? And by the time you got the kids and got out the door and got to church, everybody was not in a place to worship. I mean, I'm just going to tell you, you know? And I wish I'd have been better at that. And a preacher, you're probably dead now, but Bill Banks down in Crowder, he had a sermon. I have sermons of his on cassettes. I really love that guy. And he said, you know, we never prepare ourselves on Saturday night for Sunday morning. And that stuck with me. You know, when I'm ready to go to work, like I know I'm going to get up and go to work early in the morning. I know that I got my clean uniform. I change all my stuff I carry in my pockets. I put them over there, put my belt in my uniform, make sure I got everything ready so when I get up, I'm ready to go. You know what I mean? And yet on Saturday night, when I know I'm going to go to work on Sunday morning, and and all those Sunday mornings before I was preaching, because now I get up real early to study, so I don't have that excuse. But before I was preaching on Sunday mornings, I was always like, all right, where's my Bible? Where's this? Where's that? You know? I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for Sunday morning. And I wish I had been. And I wish I had my kids more ready for Sunday morning instead of being not ready. So I know I'm off track a little, but I just think, I've been working on a sermon, actually, a couple sermons on this with some really weird titles, but I just think we need to make not just ourselves, but the people around us. We need to find a way to make worship more. We need to be ready, ready to worship, don't we? And man, when our Sundays are frazzled and our minds are 100 different places and things aren't going the way we want them to, and we walk in that door on Sunday morning, as I did so many years of my life, I wasn't really ready to worship. I was still, and my argument over the years, and I guess I don't know what you call it, overall my years was, and I still believe it's true. I said even when I came in frazzled, I left better. I always left better than I came in, which is true, but I often think how much better I would have left if I hadn't come in frazzled. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know, just random thoughts but that's mistakes I think I made with my kids, and I because I think it taints our worship, and I think worship needs to be desirable for us to be here, and if it is, we need to make it desirable for our children to be here, and I think they feed off how we act and what we think when we get ready on a Sunday morning. So I'll give you all that for free. You might not want it, but anyway, I gave it to you. So anyway, I think that's what he means. I'm taking that, I'm making it internal within you. By making this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. What is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear, and sooner than they think, because the destruction of Jerusalem is right around the corner. So, but of course, that covenant, essentially, Judaism still exists to this day. So, but that covenant is no longer valid. It's not a valid covenant with God. And that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to tell us. The old covenant's been replaced, they knew. It is outdated, and it will soon disappear. So, he's trying to get us into that thought, because he's drawing this parallel between these two worships and these two sanctuaries and these two temples. And he's drawing this parallel, and he wants us, as Jews, he wanted them to see that old law was done away with because it was replaced basically with a parallel of that same thing. But now it's better because it's in heaven and it's not on earth anymore. So it's a better. The covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand, the table, the consecrated bread. That's the holy place. That's where that was. I need to bring a picture. I'll bring a picture. Lampstand, table. It said behind the second curtain was the most holy, what they call the Holy of Holies. That's where God was, which had the golden altar of incense, a gold-covered ark of the covenant. The ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. What do you think that ark of the covenant would be worth today on eBay? Yeah, a bunch, right? It was verified with the ark. Huh? That's right, you got to pick it up. That's right, you have to pick it up. Yeah, that's it. We suggest you bring poles. Yeah. It says, above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. One thing I always think about when I get here is how heavy that ark was. You know it? I mean, that thing is solid wood, gold covered, with gold cherubims on it. It's got 2 stone tablets inside. I'm not sure how much those weighed, but I bet they weren't light. I mean, if you watch Charlton Heston coming down off the mountain, I mean, he's struggling, right? So I don't know what that thing weighed, but they carried that on their shoulders. And I always thought, man, that's a lot of weight to pack. Right. Open to those who are obedient, right. Yeah, there was a way in, basically. Right. Right. Well, Israel existed before the law. Right? Who was Israel? Who was named Israel? Jacob. Right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Right? That was Israel. Changed his name to Israel, father of many nations. And Israel, in Jewish thought, existed in the loins of Abraham through Isaac. So Israel was before the law, right? And those who were Israel before the law, which is a lot of Paul's point, were Israel not because they were, Israel became Israel not because it was necessarily Abraham's descendants, it's because Abraham was obedient to God. You see, they were Israel because of Abraham's obedience. And that's something that Paul kind of plays in a lot. And it's our obedience of faith which makes us Israel, you see. Because not all of Abraham's descendants were Israel. Right? Not all of Abraham's descendants were Israel. So the ones who were Israel were that because of the promise. And we're children of the promise. So we're sons of Abraham, you see. It says, had a golden altar, gold-covered ark. It says, above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. Now those are the priests. And that's what they did, scores of them. They did the sacrifice, the showbread table, table of incense, all those things in Numbers and Deuteronomy. They did that. Did that all the time, every day. It said, but only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, never without blood, which he offered for himself for the sins of the people that committed in ignorance, which is, you know, couldn't get defiant sin forgiven under the law. You catch that? It's only the sins done in ignorance. That's all he could offer atonement for. He could not offer atonement for sins, for defiant sins. Under the law, there was no sacrifice for a defiant sin under the law. We know that, right? It says that right in Numbers. If you defy God, you're to be put outside the camp forever. There's not a way back. You're gone. So if you committed adultery, homosexuality, all those things that were forbidden under the law, murder, all those things that were forbidden under the law, if you did that, defiant sin, even transgressing the Sabbath could be a defiant sin, you were placed out forever. There was no way back under the law. The only thing the priest offered sacrifice for were sins done in ignorance. Okay? Accidental. That was probably open for a lot of discussion, don't you think? I think that was probably open for a lot of discussion, don't you? But we're out of time, so we'll go from here. Thanks for your time this evening.